Good evening. Thank you for joining me. Some of the terms that Carl Jung uses are used are not so familiar, so I'll try to give some information that helps to make them more clear as we go along. So this will be an excursion to the intersection of Jungian depth psychology, homeopathy, and day-to-day clinical medicine. This is my contact information. This is my email address. Should you have something that you'd like to share or a question you'd like that I might want to try to answer later on after the presentation. So it's Nikkos, Nikkos, my last name Nossaman, Nossaman, at gmail.com. So Edward Edinger recounts the story of the young transvestite who experienced the compulsion to dress in women's clothing, even to the point of wearing them under his regular clothes when in his day-to-day existence. The difficult part for him was that he felt tremendous ongoing guilt and shame as a reaction to the compulsion, though he felt confident and strong when wearing women's clothes, as opposed to his general feeling of timidity, inferiority, and impotence. In the course of his psychotherapy, a major breakthrough occurred when the physician told him the story of Odysseus and Ino from Book 5 of the Odyssey. Odysseus was adrift in tumultuous stormy seas with the risk of being dashed to death on the nearby rocks. A sea goddess Ino threw him her veil, telling him it was enchanted and it would protect him from harm. She instructed him to take off his clothes and cover himself with a veil until he reached the shore, and he subsequently swam safely to land, immediately throwing the veil back to Ino. The significance of this account lay in the symbolism of the episode, the veil of the feminine, the support of the Great Mother archetype, as providing strength and safety for the masculine in time of crisis. The patient had been living out an unconscious symbolic image. When he, upon hearing this reflection, was unable to understand the symbolism consciously and to let go of his shame, he was able to accept and welcome that aspect of his nature. Ino's veil, then, in this case, related to an archetypal image beyond the symptom of transvestism. So what had been a distressing symptom and compulsion became, upon symbolic reflection of an archetypal reality, an accepted aspect of his personality. In other words, a seemingly meaningless and tormenting symptom, acted out unconsciously, can achieve meaning by virtue of conscious reflection of its symbolic significance to the individual. Is it then possible that physical illness, with its unique constellation of symptoms, can likewise contain the potential for discovery of meaning, rather than be simply a tormenting array of meaningless symptoms? With no claim to understanding all the dynamics of illness and disease, I will attempt to elucidate some of the aspects of this issue, and to at least raise some questions and stimulate the conversation regarding this massive topic. So what do we want to look at here? We want to look at the potential for an increase in consciousness in the experience of illness. Illness we can define as a disorder of bodily, emotional, and/or mental sensation or functioning. What do we mean by increase in consciousness? An increase in the awareness of the contents of the unconscious of each of us, of the true nature of each of us as individuals. Specifically, an increase in awareness of the unique meaning of one's life. Joseph Campbell talks about this, as do others. So rather than asking the question, what is the meaning of life? The question really is, what is the meaning of my life? In other words, can significant illness represent a meaningful milestone in our lives, requiring a pause in our course and attention to awareness of our inner intention and direction? In fact, can we become conscious of a calling forth of a necessary sacrifice of some aspect of our current state? Edward Edinger, on page 109 in his book Ego and Archetype, which I highly recommend for anybody who's really interested in getting into Jungian psychology, Edward Edinger, Jung's words are pretty pithy and pretty, sometimes a little bit difficult to grasp the whole concept. Edward Edinger does an extremely good job of basically interpreting what Jung is saying and putting it into language that's more understandable. So his comment about a symbol, a symbol is an image or representation which points to something beyond itself, essentially unknown, a mystery. A symbol is subjective. It has a dynamism which exerts a positive attraction and fascination to the individual. A sign, on the other hand, relates to something identifiable, such as a cactus or a stop sign, something which is an objective known entity. A sign is dead, so to speak, while a symbol is alive and dynamic and invites our awareness. Jung said, man is in need of a symbolic life. Only the symbolic life can express the need of the soul, the daily need, mind you. So we have a quest within a quest, the quest for healing and for a dynamic symbol which catalyzes the healing process. So we can begin to think about what connections this might have with homeopathy. This whole idea of a dynamic symbol, a dynamic bridging, which catalyzes the healing process, you think of the simillimum. Edward Whitmont, a name that's probably familiar to a lot of you, is the father, of course, of Ron Whitmont, our president. He wrote a book called The Symbolic Quest, which is another very good exposition of Jungian psychology that I highly recommend if anybody is interested. In referring to the above search for consciousness, Jung describes it as the individuation process, with an emphasis on process, it seems to me. Coupling the attention to the symbolic with the quest for discovery of our individuality, we can be alive to that process of individuation, the basis for Jung's writing and his message to us. In a nutshell, he encourages us to be attentive to the appearance of the symbolic in our lives through synchronicity, dream images, active imagination, and Freudian slips, for example. Synchronicity, he defines, it's another word that he kind of came up with, I think, defines as a meaningful coincidence of two psychic or physical phenomena having no apparent cause and effect relationship. An example of that, a couple of examples might be one, we probably all heard the story at least one time about the grandfather clock in the hallway that faithfully goes on for years and years and decades. And then when the grandfather that owns the clock originally dies, the clock stops. Seemingly no apparent cause and effect relationship, but a synchronistic phenomena. Another example is, this has occurred to me, out hiking one day and climbing up this sort of semi-steep hill. And I don't know what I was thinking about, but it had something to do with how wonderful that I thought I was, that I had done something particular. And so my ego was kind of getting inflated as I was hiking up that hill, and then a branch comes along and knocks my hat off. It's like whacks me on top of the head, knocks my hat off, and as if a reminder from the elements that, maybe you're not so hot stuff after all. Again, no apparent cause and effect relationship. So synchronicity. There are many, many of those that take place in our lives every day, and it's just a matter of us kind of having our antennas up to pick up on these. Similarly with dream images, dreams, of course, as many of you know and realize, are in code. Basically, they seem kind of preposterous and odd, with odd images and odd things happening. But when they're decoded, when the symbols are decoded, basically, and you determine what the symbol is representing or trying to tell us, then they come to make good sense to us. And people can get just single dream images that are very strong impressions on them. Active imagination is focusing on an image from a dream, like somebody say dreams of a overweight duck that walks across the road in front of you. You think, well, what does that mean? So, but you can, in order to get some more information about that, you can actually get yourself in sort of a semi-meditative state and focus on and dialogue with a symbol from the dream, or even from a vision that you have in the daytime. And you can basically have a dialogue with the overweight duck, and ask. You got to be very specific about the questions that you ask and write down the whole narrative as it takes place. But you basically ask the duck, what do you have to tell me? What can I learn from you, basically? And there's sometimes big surprises when that happens. Freudian slips, of course. For example, somebody will call his wife mom, or a woman will call her husband dad, unintentionally, and referring to kind of their own lives and putting them in the position of their parent as opposed to their spouse temporarily. Okay. I like this little cartoon. Man and woman sitting in the bed, and the man saying to the woman, "When I don't dream, I feel as if I'd forgotten to put out the garbage." So, in other words, in summary, there are many paths to the discovery of the symbolic in our lives. It's just a matter of us, how interested we are in pursuing that and how interested we are in being aware of the occurrence of these situations. So developing insight into unconscious processes via this activity can help us address the endless stream of emergence of conflicts of the opposites in our lives. For example, again, Edward Whitmont writes of a patient who had decided he had a higher calling than being a husband and father. He left his family to seek his fame and fortune. Then he had a dream in which the hand of God picked him up by the scruff of the neck and returned him back to his starting point. This image, of course, requires little need for interpretation. His ego was inflated, but was in conflict with a greater self, and he received a clear message from within and from the archetypal psyche. The archetypal psyche I'll speak a little bit more about later, but it includes the totality of universal patterns and images, all of images and patterns that exist. So if within this overall quest for awareness of our true nature, when we become ill, we have the added opportunity to seek meaning within the illness experience. And that's what we're addressing here. So some assumptions that I make in what I talk about here. Number one, the unconscious is real. The personal unconscious, which contains things that we have forgotten from our past or information that we have actually repressed that was too painful for some reason. The collective unconscious, or the objective psyche, or the archetypal psyche, which is all of which is kind of behind the curtain, so to speak, in the universe and in our lives, that is not available to us except in dreams, in synchronicities, etc. So basically the whole storehouse of patterns and informations that exists in the universe. Another assumption is the individuation process involves a progressive increase in consciousness of an individual, i.e. those things which are in the unconscious brought to consciousness, and we'll talk about that a little bit more too. Another assumption is about psyche and soma. And Jung, Jung spoke of the psyche always being involved in illness, mental or physical. Quote, quoting Jung, "Since psyche and matter are contained in one and the same world, and moreover are in continuous contact with one another and ultimately rest on irrepresentable transcendental factors, it is not only possible, but fairly probable even, that psyche and matter are two different aspects of one and the same thing." And that's a pretty powerful statement. It's interesting to see that he says fairly probable, because he's usually pretty strident in his opinions. But nonetheless, the unity of psyche and soma, and I think we as homeopathic providers don't have any difficulty in relating to that statement. So given that the brilliant author of this mode of viewing, i.e. Jung, this mode of viewing our lives and our universe, given that he wrote massive volumes in its explication, and that I am making an attempt to encapsulate some of this in a short presentation, there's a lot more to be said about the subject. I'm just hoping to scratch the surface. Blame and shame. It's not unusual these days for people to inquire of an individual who is experiencing an illness, especially a chronic one, how that individual might have brought on their own illness. You've probably all had that experience. witnessing it, or maybe even have it directed toward you. This, of course, raises the specter of blame to be added to the illness experience. What have I done wrong? I look at it as not a question of blame, but rather a matter of you are not to blame for your illness, but you are responsible for dealing with it. So in what ways do our bodies mediate elements of the unconscious? The autonomic nervous system, the central nervous system, the immune system, the hormonal system, somatic memories, and interactions among these systems, all of which are not under voluntary control. So the autonomic, and you're of course all, you who are medical types are all familiar with these. The autonomic nervous system, including the sympathetic fight or flight nervous system, or parasympathetic, or in other words, rest and digest nervous systems, affect digestion, urinary function, blood flow, respiration, activity of the heart, sexual function, etc. These are all not under our voluntary control, of course, and I relate those to the unconscious. The central nervous system, including addiction tendencies, impulsiveness, connections with the hypothalamus, etc. And of course, the midbrain is more primitive and relates to unconscious or vegetative functions. The immune system, the cellular and humoral aspects of the immune system, hormonal systems, and the whole web of hormonal interactions in our body, and then somatic bodily encoded memories. And those of you who do body work or who have experienced body work know about that whole thing of what memories can be stored in muscle and soft tissues and so on. If you've been rolfed, or if you've just had a massage that touches a particular emotional point beyond just the physical experience of the massage. So trauma reactions as encoded in the body, various tensions, cramps, paralyses, etc. And encoded in the unconscious, connected with the autonomic nervous system as well as the other systems above. So far then, we know that a massive amount of what goes on in our bodies is not under voluntary control. From what's been said, my conclusion is that the unconscious and these non-voluntary physiological symptoms are intimately related. That's not an original thought on my part, but it makes sense. So here are the elements of our beings. We have consciousness, where the ego thinks it's at the wheel. We have the personal unconscious, and then the collective unconscious, or the objective or archetypal psyche, and the physical body with all the elements of its defense mechanism. So that's the package. The archetypal psyche is a timeless, and this is a quote from Jung, the timeless and unlimited array of universal patterns and images, the underlying principle of all experience. That's pretty comprehensive. And again from Jung, from the Collective Works, Volume 8, the self is the structuring and ordering principle which unifies the various archetypal contents and can be viewed as the archetype of wholeness. It designates the whole range of psychic phenomena in man, expresses the unity of the personality as a whole, an unknowable essence which we can't grasp as such, since by definition it transcends our power of comprehension. It might equally be called the God within us, or you can call it the universe for those who are uncomfortable with the term God. So this is his description of the self, or what he calls the self or the greater self. When we become ill, we usually don't have the conscious awareness of what's going on other than the symptoms we experience. If they have meaning beyond that, we usually have no idea what it is. All of you, I'm sure, are familiar with the name Louise Hay, who I understand recently died, actually. She compiled a book in which she proposed metaphysical causes, quote, to all physical illness. Some examples would be, this is what she says about tuberculosis. Wasting away, this is the metaphysical connection with tuberculosis in her mind. Wasting away from selfishness, possessive, cruel thoughts, and revenge. Or in relation to knee problems, she said the metaphysical connection with knee problems relates to a stubborn ego and pride, inability to bend, fear, inflexibility, won't give in. She lists positive affirmations after each one of these categories. I don't doubt that many of her conclusions have some validity, and it strikes me that in some sense her categorization is somewhat like the standard formulas for dream symbols that one can see assembled in some popular books. Jung states categorically that the symbols appearing in individual dreams are to be understood by their associations with the individual dreamer and not in a stock sense. So in other words, personal associations have everything to do with the meaning of dreams. And Jung always would say, when somebody presents me with it, and him with his experience, always said, when somebody presents me with a dream, I have absolutely no idea what the meaning of the dream is until we get into the personal associations with the individual. An example would be somebody dreams of a pair of scissors, and kind of the stock interpretation of the symbol of scissors would be something cutting through something else, either in a way to manifest more information about it, or to divide something in two, or the kind of thing that scissors do. But a personal association could be totally different from that. A personal association of somebody having a dream of a pair of scissors could be, my grandma always used to have these beautiful silver scissors when she sewed, and it just reminds me of a place, one of the few places of my life where I felt safe was my grandma while she was sitting and sewing. Or another personal association could be with scissors, could be my brother used to attack me with scissors, which would be exactly the opposite kind of association. So again, it's personal and subjective. And Jung, Edinger, Whitmont, they all emphasize the importance of the subjective as opposed to the objective. And here's another example of it, which conveys the significance of the symbol. There's a website which addresses the metaphysical meaning of symptoms in a stock fashion as well, which is kind of interesting. And here you can see it's a French website, ECOUTETONCORPS.com. And you click on resources and it gives you some example interpretations. I guess it's something you can pay for and join otherwise, but you do get some examples if you use the drop-down menu of resources, and then it'll give you some examples. So personal associations and individual symptoms that I just described earlier. On the most rudimentary level, somebody has a chihuahua. On the most rudimentary level, I think a chihuahua. On the most rudimentary level, many times just the knowledge or consciousness of a diagnosis of the illness one is experiencing can provide a modest lessening of anxiety. In my experience, and in my understanding from the accounts of depth psychology analysts, it can be therapeutic for the patient to experience a reflection of what they are going through. This can span all the way from instances of paraphrasing what they are saying by an interested party, to a reflection of a myth or a synchronicity that parallels an aspect of their suffering or their stuckness. Again, the homeopathic people can recognize case-taking as a perfect example of this, and that just the experience of taking an individual's case and the mirroring phenomenon and the listening phenomenon and the soundboard phenomenon will be a stimulus to healing all by itself, even before a remedy is administered. So examples of this, of course, the myth of Odysseus and Ino that we talked about. And there's another one that I'm going to read to you, which I think is very interesting, and some of you probably know. Jung's account of the patient who was not progressing in her analysis until she experienced a synchronous event in conjunction with a dream. And this is Jung, quoting Jung. My example of synchronicity, as well as the emergence of a symbolic image, concerns a young woman who, despite all efforts made on both sides, proved to be psychologically inaccessible. The difficulty lay in the fact that she always knew better about everything. Her excellent education had provided her with a weapon ideally suited to this purpose. namely a highly polished Cartesian rationalism with an impeccably geometrical idea of reality. After several fruitless attempts to sweeten her rationalism with a somewhat more human understanding, this is Jung speaking, I had to confine myself to the hope that something unexpected and irrational would turn up, something that would burst the intellectual retort into which she had sealed herself. Well, I was sitting opposite her one day with my back to the window, listening to her flow of rhetoric. She had an impressive dream the night before in which someone had given her a golden scarab, a costly piece of jewelry. While she was still telling me this dream, I heard something behind me gently tapping on the window. I turned around and I saw that it was a fairly large flying insect that was knocking against the window pane from outside in the obvious effort to get into the dark room. This seemed to me very strange. I opened the window immediately and caught the insect in the air as it flew in. It was a scarabaeid beetle, or common rose chafer. And leave it to Jung, he had to give the genus and the species a Cetonia aurata. And the beetle had a gold-green color, most nearly resembling that of a golden scarab. I handed the beetle to my patients with the word, "Here is your scarab." This experience punctured the desired hole in her rationalism and broke the ice of her intellectual resistance. The treatment could now be continued with satisfactory results. That's a different colored beetle, not a green one, or not a green scarab, but a different colored one. Another word that Dr. Whitmont came up with, entelechy, describes an implicate form principle which directs the dynamics of matter in cells and brings them into manifestation on the explicate level. To this he applies the Aristotelian term entelechy, which is translatable as something like inherent goal-directedness to describe this mysterious phenomenon. I think it's fair to view entelechy as being present prior to conscious awareness. We might ask how this differs from homeostasis, the tendency for living things to restore order when order has been disrupted as a result of many possible stimuli. I submit that entelechy is a more encompassing phenomenon, with the inherent goal-directedness referring to the inherent drive within all of us to seek individuation. With this assumption, homeostasis would relate more to getting the train back on the track, and entelechy as including the track itself, having a clear direction and destination, most of which is to be discovered and brought into consciousness in that individuation journey. This is a stained glass window, I think in a courthouse or the post office or somewhere in Chicago. And mandala, the word mandala, which is a symbol for completeness that Jung talked about, not just Jung, but other people, of course, M-A-N-D-A-L-A, is a symbol for wholeness. Whitmont refers to the sacrifice, the word sacrifice meaning to make sacred. He refers to the sacrifice to the entelechy involved in the experience of a significant illness, that we must give in to tissue changes or perhaps to attitude changes or to a creative urge in us that wants to be born. An example of the latter would be Jung's, at age 75, severe febrile illness which led him to write Answer to Job. Upon completion of Answer to Job, his illness ended abruptly, and he was quite sick during this whole process, but somehow still managed to write. Answer to Job is pretty pivotal in his perception of psychology. Another example of symbolic reflection is of a patient with ulcerative colitis, who in the course of his treatment became aware of his state of having been scapegoated through his life. His treatment being homeopathic treatment, and some of this which had been unconscious to him became conscious as a result of the homeopathic treatment. He became aware of his state of having been scapegoated through his life. The scapegoat, of course, symbolizes the one person upon whom is projected all the sins and shortcomings of the family or of the community. He became aware that he had even been the willing scapegoat, without allowing himself the capacity to vent or to act upon his feelings about his maddening situation. The emergence of awareness of this symbol and the consciousness of how his digestive system had borne the brunt of his emotional frustration was a great help in the process of his healing. In the 1980s, when I was still smoking cigarettes, I had a recurrent dream in which I was preparing to join a game of basketball, always basketball, which was something that I played when I was younger. But I was always frustrated by something or another which prevented me from... I can hear you okay, Augustine. I'm going to go ahead, though. But I was always frustrated by something, trying to get into these basketball games. I was always frustrated by something or another. Augustine? Augustine? I'm afraid he's not muted. Let me see if I can do that. Participants. Alex. Augustine? I don't think he can hear me. Okay. Anyway, I was trying to get into a game of basketball in my dreams, but something would always go wrong. I would forget my shoes. I couldn't find the gymnasium. I showed up at the wrong time for the game. Never did I get into the game. In my life, I had always been active athletically, and the dreams were very frustrating. My eventual awareness was that there may have been some connection between my dreams of unsuccessful athletic attempts and the fact that I was damaging my vitality by smoking cigarettes. This contributed to my heightened resolve to quit smoking. When I was finally successful with the help, when I look back at this experience, it seems to support the added value of reflection from the unconscious beyond the nonetheless valuable level of reflection that one may receive in conscious life, such as from a loved one or a caregiver. So, viewing illness as a dream. The very same process of dream analysis can be in play when an individual is experiencing a state of illness or symptoms and is in search of meaning, which can be provided by an experience of the symbolic life, from a dream, a synchronicity, the reflection of a mythological parallel, etc. This would be the transformation of unconscious suffering to conscious suffering. When there is a tension between the opposites, the desires of the ego being countered by what is coming into our life via the self, then Jung tells us that our healthiest option is to hold that tension and to seek a reconciling symbol that will lead to resolution of the conflict. He refers to the reconciling symbol as the transcendent function. Let me give you an example. A woman could be locked in a dispute with her mother-in-law with no apparent way of resolving the situation. If she holds the tension between, number one, what is coming into her life, i.e. the difficult relationship, and two, what her ego wants for the mother-in-law to behave, quote, unquote, without unconsciously acting out in the form of despair or outright anger or lashing out, and she seeks a reconciling symbol, perhaps with a little prayer for help thrown in. The daughter-in-law may receive via a dream or synchronicity that very symbol which will help her move ahead. An example of a dream that might be helpful would be that the daughter-in-law could have a dream where she looks in the mirror and sees her mother-in-law's face. That could stimulate a consciousness of how what her mother-in-law is doing may be the same thing that she's doing. It often turns out that the bad behavior of the mother-in-law is in fact an unconscious projection of the daughter-in-law's own attitude toward her mother-in-law. When this becomes conscious by withdrawing the projection, i.e. bringing it to consciousness, she has moved from a state of unconscious suffering to a state of conscious suffering, which is amenable to problem solving and responding to the mirroring of the situation. A similar situation can hold true in other illness where the illness is an unwelcome gift, quote, from the self and is resisted by the ego. A symbolic reflection, if the ill individual holds attention, seeks awareness, and is fortunate, can help with a measure of added consciousness of meaning. This all sounds so simple, but involves the becoming aware of one's own unconscious behavior by being made aware of it through shadow projection, attributing it to another person because it is unacceptable to oneself and therefore unconscious. Acknowledgement of the shadow and striving to develop consciousness of it, to withdraw the projection and own the behavior, is a central feature of Jungian psychology, of course. On the psyche-soma spectrum, we have the ego consciousness and the voluntary musculoskeletal and nervous systems, coupled with the unconscious psyche and the involuntary systems of the physical body and its physiology. We are seeking the bridge building by way of living symbols, leading to conscious understanding and meaning. The emergence of the unifying symbol can come from the consulting room of the Jungian analyst, from the reflection of a perceptive and devoted friend or loved one or other caregiver, from dreams, visions, synchronicities, and active imagination, from a reflection by the homeopathic prescriber. A potent metaphor for all of these modules is that of the mirror, the reflection from which can lead to levels of healing. Homeopathy, utilizing an energetic healing stimulus which matches the energetic configuration of the constellation of symptoms of the person who is ill, also has the capacity to act as a potentized, reconciling symbol that builds the bridge from the unconscious to consciousness. So what is our illness asking of us? Whitmont again writes of the sacrifice, again making sacred, to the entelechy. We may have to sacrifice an attitude, some bodily part or tissue, our attachment to something which no longer supports us, etc. The transformation of symptom to symbol. And this is Edinger that I'm quoting here. A symptom can be transformed into a symbol. A symptom can be transformed into a symbol through awareness of its archetypal foundations. To see the symbolic image behind the symptom, I'm going to start that over again, sorry. A symptom can be transformed into a symbol through awareness of its archetypal foundations. To see the symbolic image behind the symptom immediately transforms the experience. It may be just as painful, but now has meaning. Again, this is Edinger speaking. To the extent that one is unaware of the symbolic dimension of existence, one experiences the vicissitudes of life as symptoms. Symptoms are disturbing states of mind which we are unable to control and which are essentially meaningless. That is, they contain no value or significance. Symptoms are intolerable precisely because they are meaningless. Almost any difficulty can be borne if we can discern its meaning. It is meaninglessness which is the greatest threat to humanity. Our waking life is composed of a series of moods, feelings, ideas, and urgencies. These successive psychic states through which we pass are like beads strung on a single string. Depending on our conscious attitude, we experience this rosary of life either as a succession of meaningless symptoms or through the symbolic awareness as a series of numinous encounters between the ego and the transpersonal psyche. This is again from his book, Ego and Archetype, that I recommended earlier. Again, Edinger describes the case of a man who was consumed by anger and unable to gain perspective on it. He prayed for help and immediately saw the image from the book of Daniel in the Bible of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, having been thrown there in a rage by Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar did this because of their refusal to bow down to his golden idol. The three did not perish in the flames, however. The patient understood from the symbolism that King Nebuchadnezzar represented an arbitrary, tyrannical, power-driven figure who would usurp the prerogatives of God and rage when he is not treated as a deity, the ego identifying with the self. The survival of the fiery furnace for the three symbolized the patient's willingness to avoid identifying with the anger, to endure it and seek its meaning through active imagination. The endurance, or i.e. holding the tension that I mentioned earlier, and the search for what was behind the anger was still part of the task ahead for him. This brings up the point of the work that needs to be done after the reflection from the symbol has taken place. In other words, in the case of the transvestite fellow, he gained comfort and meaning of the symbol from the account of the myth, though he still had the job of addressing his lack of confidence. And the fellow with ulcerative colitis still having the task of addressing the pattern of his acting as a willing scapegoat, and how through becoming of his own shadow he may be acting as the ultimate persecutor of himself. As this work is taking place and more consciousness emerges, the psychosomatic connection to the illness, the physical, mental, and emotional symptoms, can reveal itself via symbols and an increase in the meaning of those symbols. One of my patients describes herself as being interminably in a hurry, always in a hurry, never can stick with things very long, always hurrying. I suggested to her the image of the Roadrunner in the cartoon, the Roadrunner, the beep beep. And she said, that doesn't really seem to fit. And I said, okay, how about the White Rabbit in Alice in Wonderland? And she says, yes, that's exactly right. The White Rabbit who's always saying, I'm late for a very important date. Another patient had a recurrent dream of a three-dimensional elevator, meaning an elevator which would start to go up or go down, and then it would start swinging like something like a pendulum, or even like something swinging in a whole arc. The elevator wasn't just going in a linear pattern; it was going in a circular pattern, swinging around wildly. And she didn't know what to make of this, but it was very disturbing to her. And then one night she dreamed. When she had that dream, she made the connection when she woke up that she saw her mother's eyes in the elevator. And she concluded that this sort of represented her childhood, which was characterized by trying to please her mother constantly, her mother who was an alcoholic, always trying to please her, and the mother always being critical and never being able to be pleased, and always being off balance and never knowing what her mother was going to do next. She saw her mother's eyes there and realized that how she had been tormented and terrorized by this, and had developed some consciousness into the work that she needed to do to separate from her mother who was still living. Third example is of a woman with tremendous fatigue and depletion, and she's a religious person who ministers to a lot of people. And we talked about what myth might kind of fit, what image or myth might kind of fit this picture of what she does in her life. So in the upper right-hand corner, the lower left-hand corner, you can see the stick person image. This doesn't translate very well. It's kind of through two process of reproduction. But in the lower left-hand corner, you can see the individual holding up the round, what it amounts to the earth, like Atlas holding up the whole earth. The image above that is keeping all of these balls in the air, juggling. And then the upper right, standing on the earth as opposed to bearing the earth on her shoulders. And then the lower right with all the balls are on the ground, and she's focused on her center and attention to herself. And then in the center, of course, as you see, a cross between insanity, and then you see what it says, serenity, starting from the S in insanity, and then the ego branching out from the word E. She found this reflection sound turned out to be somewhat comforting for her. Here's a picture that's kind of dark, but you can see the picture of the alchemist at work in the alchemist studio, working on the conversion of metals and chemicals and so on, in search of the philosopher's stone, which is a parallel in Jung with the individuation process. He found the alchemists very interesting to study because they were pretty much functioning unconsciously in that whole process, which is very much akin to the individuation process. And then you'll see the woman sitting there with her work on her lap, and she's what they call the soror mystica, the mystical sister, or probably the guy's wife, very possibly, but in sort of spiritual term, the mystical sister. And it's the presence of the feminine Again, like the presence of the feminine in Eno and Odysseus, the significance of the presence of the feminine in this whole process, implying balance in this whole process. So having said all this, the quest for a living symbol is not easy or simple, and can be but part of an incremental journey into our true selves, containing the tension between what is expected and desired, i.e. the ego, and what the archetypal psyche brings us without our inviting it, and seeking the emergence of the bridge-building symbol is a worthy quest for us. Our reward along these small steps is the pure gold of added meaning. Sorry, I'll say that sentence again. Our reward along these small steps is the pure gold of added meaning to and consciousness of our individuality. One of my favorite quotes. Ring the bells that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There's a crack in everything. That's where the light gets in. I'm going to take just a second. I want to read you the final paragraph of that relates to this. I'll be right back. Yes, so I want to conclude by this, again by Edward Edinger. The word symbol derives from the Greek word symbolon, which combines two root words, sym, meaning together or with, and bolon, meaning bolon, that is, meaning that which has been thrown. So the basic meaning is that which has been thrown together. In original Greek usage, symbols referred to the two halves of an object, such as a stick or a coin, which two parties broke between them as a pledge, and to prove later the identity of the presenter of one part to the holder of the other. The term corresponded to our word tally, concerning which Webster's Unabridged Dictionary states, it was customary for traders, after notching a stick to show the number or quantity of goods delivered, to split the stick lengthwise through the notches, so that the parts exactly corresponded, the seller keeping one stick and the purchaser the other. A symbol was thus originally a tally referring to the missing piece of an object, which, when restored to or thrown together with its partner, recreated the original whole object. This corresponds to our understanding of the psychological function of a symbol. The symbol leads us to the missing part of the whole man. It relates us to our original totality. It heals our split, our alienation from life. And since the whole man is a great deal more than the ego, it relates us to the superpersonal forces, which are the source of our being and our meaning. This is the reason for honoring subjectivity and cultivating the symbolic life. Thank you. So, anybody have any questions, or anybody, are there any questions or instances you'd like to share?
Hello?
Yes, I can hear you.
Hi. First
Hi.
of all, it was a powerful, wonderful talk. Thank you so much. I was wondering if you could give us an example of a remedy acting as a bridge.
Well, I think... go ahead. Sorry.
No, I'm done.
Yeah. Anne, I didn't hear your last name, who you are?
Ann Mick. I'm in Vermont.
Oh, yeah.
Hi.
Okay. Oh, yeah. All right. I remember you. So, without there being, well, the example of the ulcerative colitis patients, for example, the bridge with the prescription of the medicine, the first medicine I prescribed for him was Colosenthis, but that was based on the totality of his symptoms and, what position he assumed when he was in pain, abdominal pain from the colitis. But that and our reflection together across the consulting room related to him being able to bring to consciousness the whole issue of the scapegoat. And so that was a bridging by the remedy, promoting emergence of some consciousness of the situation. So that would be an example, I think. Does that make sense?
Very helpful, yes. And yes, go on, sorry.
Oh, that's okay. And what the other thing I was going to say, of course, is that's the beauty of what we do as homeopaths, that we have this wonderful opportunity to have the simillimum, or to seek the simillimum, as is the same thing as seeking the reconciling symbol that helps to provide, or helps to bridge the gap on an unconscious level. So we'll have people who are suffering from a particular illness, and we find the right medicine, the simillimum, hopefully, and things get better. We may not be around to know what emerges into consciousness beyond that, but even knowing that bridging takes place, that mirroring of the energies takes place, and the person gets better. So that's just a testimony to how lucky we are.
Yes, thank you. And
Yes, thank you.
with um, so we are leaving Louise Hay symbolism somewhat as well. So, as you mentioned, the example of tuberculosis, that there is only one symbol for tuberculosis. And then you mentioned with your example with the scissors, there it could mean many things for different people. Is that the same thing for diseases?
Yes, I think so. I think so.
Thank
Um,
you.
for example, I mean, you look at what she said about tuberculosis, and you think, is that any patient that we know of that this has been treated for tuberculosis, or even somebody who has responded positively to tuberculinum, do they all fit into that category? And some of them kind of tangential, kind of uh, crossing of some of those symptoms, but it didn't. But I don't know that it's sort of like, I mean, it doesn't make any sense to me that all of them would be that way. Again, like you say, with the scissors example, that is, the personal connections, personal associations carry a lot of weight there.
Great example. Thank you, Nick.
Yes, thank you.
Hey, Nick, can you hear me? Doug Brown here in Portland, Oregon.
Yes, I can hear you, Doug.
Nick,
Hi.
thank you. Yeah, hi there. Thanks. Also, thank you so much for a beautiful presentation. A couple of thoughts I'd love to hear your response to. One is that it seems to me that one possible, maybe mistaken conclusion a listener might come to is that the remedy itself might, at the conscious level, be taken as the connecting bridge or the symbol by the patient, which I think you would agree is not necessarily the case. One example that comes to mind in my own practice is a patient of mine who's doing very beautifully on lac loxodonta, the milk of the African elephant. For him, a symbol that's so important, he calls it his spirit animal. Oh, sorry, it's my phone going. It'll stop in a moment. His spirit animal is the white wolf, which in a certain life situation, he actually saw a wolf which he felt saved him from certain death by an encounter with a grizzly bear. His whole life story and psyche fit very much the pattern of lac loxodonta, which is very healing to him, and he's now becoming much more aware of family dynamics and all of the things that he does to basically suppress his own emotions to be at the service of his family. And lac loxodonta continues to serve him very well as a remedy. But for him, his spirit animal continues to be the white wolf. And so I just wanted to point out that at least in many cases, the remedy itself is not necessarily at the conscious level for the patient, that symbolic bridge. And for me, what this points out is that viewing Jungian analysis in general and how it relates to our work as homeopaths, I think we become very aware through our work that when we're in an energetic state, we are in a way possessed. And no amount of reason or rationality, even at the symbolic level sometimes, can bring us out of the state. We need something energetic which helps us heal, and it takes place at this mysterious level that is really completely beyond our intellectual capacities of self-understanding. And that's one reason I really appreciate the work of James Hillman, who faults, in a way, Jung for being overly committed to self-analysis in a kind of rational way. Hillman talks about the importance of respecting dreams in a way as phenomena in and of themselves which defy the possibility of interpretation. So I guess I just would love to hear your comments on that.
Well, I think that, there's many facets to that, what you just said, one of them being, I think you were referring to the doctrine of signatures as applying or not applying in the choice of a medicine. I think, did I understand you correctly there? For example, like somebody who has a personality who they kind of sting people, and they're warm-blooded and they're thirstless, and they kind of sting people and can be critical of people and jealous in conversations. You sort of think, well, that sounds like a bee, right? And then is apis their remedy or not? Am I connecting there with you in that?
Yeah, I mean, I hadn't thought of it that way, but yes, that makes sense.
Okay, and then the whole thing about dreams defying understanding. I mean, I think that's kind of something that probably all of us encounter in the consulting room of our patients who we don't find the remedy for. We don't find that bridge, and I would posit that not that it doesn't exist, but that we just haven't found it, basically. And similarly with dreams, I think if there's a gut, if in a reflection in dream analysis, if the person makes a personal association and they put these pieces of symbolically interpreted pieces together in the dream and reflects it back to themselves, if that affects on a gut level the person, or including breaking into tears or saying, "Oh my God, that's absolutely right. I feel it in my gut." Then we, I think we kind of hit the bullseye. And similarly with the whole approach to the simillimum. But I think the failing probably takes place in us and not in the whole process. And by the way, what you were saying about the mystery, I mean, I love the mystery of how homeopathy works, and it doesn't bother me if it's nanoparticles or if it's an energetic phenomenon or whatever it is. It doesn't bother me, doesn't worry me that I don't know what it is, but more kind of practically what results from it,
Yeah. Thank you, Nick.
Really thank you for your comments.
Yeah.
Hi, Alex.
Hello. How are you?
Okay. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you. I hope you can hear me.
I can hear you very well.
I joined a little bit late. I unfortunately had someone late as a patient, so I've heard a little bit of your talk, and I probably want to listen to it again. So I have a little bit of course, understanding of Jungian philosophy, but there are different, for me, there are of course different kinds of ways that we can have insight into our condition, whatever our condition is, and it seems to me that there are also, I think, another method, which I was just talking to a friend of mine and realized that when we do a consultation, a regular homeopathic consultation, without sort of a straightforward one, sometimes at the end of the consultation, you'll have a patient see clearly certain issues that they hadn't seen before because of the nature of asking those questions and going through that. And so they can often deal with that particular issue in a more constructive way. Of course, we're not dealing with unconscious issues, but another way that I think that can be, that I had a thought about is that, in art, like especially in literature, there is a term called pathos. The pathos, for example, in tragedy, in Julius Caesar, Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, at the end he says, which many people make fun of this, which is, he says, and you too, Brutus. If you remember, he says, you too, Brutus, which
Yes.
is, if you read the whole play, which absolutely stabs you at that point. You feel the pain. In fact, that is what the pain that Julius feels. Caesar, he feels more the pain of that betrayal than the stabbing of the actual swords which kill him. So in other words, sometimes if we can, the patient can come to the point where whatever story that he has been telling us, his life story, etc., there is a point in which I think, without a lot of complications, whether psychological analysis, often the patients will find that there is a point in which they understand, like you were saying, that I'm a scapegoat in this family, or I'm a, there's a point in which the consciousness of that reality comes about, and it can be, I think, a very intense experience for the patient if they actually are brought to that experience. Is that your experience with this sort of level of bringing these symbols to the patient's attention?
Oh yeah, I totally agree with that, and I would posit that the actual process of that mirroring that we do in the consultation room, it's not that they are unaware of the experience, but they have the full awareness of the experience to the point of it being much more painful. I think if I understand what you're saying,
yes,
become much more painful and much more acute in their consciousness. So it's like they were conscious of having had the experience, but not conscious of the intense kind of weight of that in their lives until you help them discover that.
Exactly. It's just like coming to the end of the tragedy and suddenly realizing this is a real tragedy. Here. Yes. This is
that patient's individual tragedy.
And they realize that the extent of that weight that they've been carrying, and
yeah, and I think that's a golden moment in the consultation. It doesn't mean that's the end of it, but it means here it is glowing right in our faces, and this is what we're working on.
Exactly. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, Augustine. Thank you very much for your help. Thanks for you who tuned in, and I appreciate your comments.